If you've ever wondered how some of the most nutrient-dense, resilient, survival-ready plants in history somehow ended up labeled as weeds, you're not alone. I've spent years working with growers, herbalists, soil scientists, and old-school homesteaders, and there's one truth they all quietly agree on. The plants that give you the most value are almost never the ones big agriculture wants you to pay attention to. Some of them grow too easily. Some of them don't require fertilizers, pesticides, or expensive seed packets. And some of them are just a little too useful nutritionally, medicinally, or even industrially for the industries built around controlling and monetizing the modern food system. That's why today, we're diving into the plants that were once revered, relied on, and even worshipped. Yet today are treated like invaders, nuisances, or in some cases, crops you can actually get fined or banned for planting. These aren't fringe herbs. These are legitimate superfoods that our ancestors treasured, and they didn't stop being powerful. The world just stopped talking about them. Let's start with amaranth, the so-called weed that once fed entire civilizations. If you've never grown it, here's what makes amaranth different from almost everything you will find in a modern grain field. It simply refuses to die. Heat waves, drought, bad soil. Amaranth thrives where wheat and corn collapse. Historically, it was the backbone of the Aztec Empire, a grain with a complete amino acid profile, rich in iron, magnesium, calcium, and B vitamins. I've grown dozens of grains over the years, and amaranth is the one crop that consistently outperforms everything in terms of nutrition per square foot. But when Spanish colonial forces realized how deeply connected it was to indigenous culture and strength, they didn't just discourage it, they outlawed it. Growing amaranth could get you punished, even executed. That's how dangerous it was considered. Today we're not seeing those punishments, of course, but certain species of amaranth are still classified as noxious weeds, restricted, controlled, or heavily monitored. It's a quiet shadow of a much louder history. Then there's purslane, a plant most gardeners yank out of the soil without realizing they just threw away one of the best omega-3 sources in nature. Purslane's nutritional profile is almost unbelievable the first time you see it. More omega-3 fatty acids than any leafy vegetable, plus a pharmacological amount of antioxidants, minerals, and vitamins A, C, and E. The funny part? Purslane grows itself. It pops up between cracks, in neglected corners, in the dry patches where other plants fail. And that's exactly why agricultural institutions labeled it a weed. Purslane doesn't make anyone money. It doesn't need a seed company. It doesn't need chemicals. It doesn't need a market. I can tell you from experience, once you let purslane colonize a corner of your garden, you basically have a free salad bar for life. But free food doesn't fit the business model of an industry, built on selling inputs, additives, and dependence. So purslane became a pest, not a product. A plant to destroy, not harvest. A perfect food that the modern food chain completely ignored. Lamb's quarters, also known as wild spinach, is another survivor that became a villain simply because it grows too easily. I've watched this plant thrive in poor soils, compacted soils, sandy soils, clay soils, you name it. It's unstoppable. And nutritionally, it's a powerhouse. Higher in protein than spinach. 3 times the calcium. More iron, more folate, more bioavailable minerals, and an earthy flavor that tastes like the vegetables your grandparents swear used to taste better. But that's the thing. Lamb's quarters doesn't need you to plant it. It doesn't need to be watered. It doesn't care about fertilizer. In other words, it doesn't need the agricultural industry at all. So what happened? Universities began labeling it a weed. Extension offices told farmers to eradicate it. Regulatory agencies put certain species under restricted plant lists. Meanwhile, every veteran grower I've ever met smirks when it appears. Because it means they're getting a free nutrient-dense crop without doing a thing. And then we get to hemp, the plant that didn't just get downgraded or ignored, it got criminalized. When you work with farmers long enough, you start hearing the same story over and over. Hemp wasn't banned because it was dangerous. It was banned because it was too useful. It threatened too many industries at once. Hemp could replace paper, reduce deforestation, outperform cotton, replace plastics, produce food-grade oils, and heal damaged soil. Its seeds are a complete protein. Its fibers are among the strongest natural materials on Earth. Its growth rate is so fast it embarrasses trees. The ban wasn't about public safety, it was about competition. Entire industries lobbied against it. Propaganda was funded. Fields were burned. Research was buried. You cannot talk to longtime cultivators without hearing frustration in their voice about the decades lost because of that ban. So what do all these plants have in common? Amaranth, purslane, lamb's quarters, hemp. They grow without permission. They thrive without chemicals. They provide nutrition or value without needing corporate intermediaries. And that's the one thing modern agricultural systems can't monetize. As someone who spent decades watching growers rediscover these plants, I can tell you, the suppression wasn't accidental. It was cultural, economic, political, and in some cases, aggressively intentional. And now that people are waking up to their power again, you're going to see more conversations, more pushback, more attempts to regulate or restrict under the guise of control, management, or invasive species prevention. But behind all that language lies one simple truth. Useful plants are only weeds when they aren't profitable. If you've ever grown any of these, or if you've got a hidden gem plant that you think has been unfairly ignored or demonized, share it. The comments on videos like this always surprise me. People around the world growing superfoods in ditches, alleyways, and abandoned lots simply because no one told them to stop. That community knowledge is how these plants survive suppression and come back stronger than ever. If you want to look deeper into any of the plants I mentioned today, I've put every resource in the description. Nothing salesy, nothing pushed, just the stuff I personally use or recommend after years in the field. And remember this, the next time someone calls a plant a weed, ask yourself who benefits from you not knowing its value, because history shows it's rarely an accident. What people forget is that the modern definition of a weed has almost nothing to do with nutrition, usefulness, or value. It's an economic label, a control label, a way of shaping behavior without having to explain the deeper reason. Most gardeners think a weed is simply a plant you didn't intend to grow, but that's not how these labels originated. Historically, weed classification came from agricultural boards influenced directly by the industries that stood to lose the most from free, resilient, nutrient-dense plants. You see this pattern over and over. If a plant feeds people cheaply, if it grows without soil conditioners or expensive hybrid seeds, if it threatens the financial ecosystem around industrial crops, it magically becomes a weed. I've had agronomists admit this off the record. Plants weren't suppressed because they were harmful. They were suppressed because they were independent. Take amaranth again. When you dig into the journals and archives, you realize how efficient the campaign was. Indigenous farmers knew the plant was a marvel grain from the seeds, spinach-like leaves for greens, stems for forage, deep roots that stabilize soil. It was a whole ecosystem in one plant. But when the colonial powers outlawed its cultivation, they weren't fighting a plant. They were fighting a culture, a food system, a worldview that didn't depend on outside supply. Modern agriculture still carries residues of that mindset. The idea that only controlled crops with centralized seed supply are valid. Meanwhile, the rest? Volunteer plants, nuisances, wild growth. I've walked through old gardens where amaranth still pops up generations after nobody intentionally planted it. That's the mark of a plant that refuses to be erased. And the same is true for purslane. If you talk to elders in rural communities, especially those who grew up before chemical agriculture took over, they all tell you purslane was a staple. It wasn't exotic. It wasn't a novelty. It was something your grandmother tossed into stews, into breads, into cooling summer dishes because it grew everywhere and kept people healthy during lean seasons. Fast forward to today, and it's incredible how many nutritionists have rediscovered purslane only to be shocked by its composition. The omega-3 content alone puts most supermarket greens to shame. But because purslane is too hardy, too free, too self-propagating, the seed industry never embraced it. Why would they? You can drop one piece of purslane on the ground and come back a week later to a full patch. No one can patent that. No one can monopolize it. And so, the plant became invisible not because its value dropped, but because it couldn't be monetized. Lamb's quarters has a similar story, but with an added layer of irony. If you take a soil sample in an abandoned field and lamb's quarters show up, it's usually a good sign. The plant is a natural soil indicator. It tells you the ground still has life in it. It means the land isn't dead. But because it grows abundantly, it threatens modern narratives about scarcity. Think about it. If one plant can give you spinach-level greens for free, rich in minerals and protein, what does that do to the business model behind packaged produce? I've had multiple farmers laugh as they pull lamb. quarters out of a commercial plot while secretly setting aside a handful for their own kitchen. They trust the plant more than they trust what's being sold. That says everything. Then we have hemp, the one that still carries the strongest stigma even after legalization efforts. To understand hemp's ban, you have to understand how industrial power structures operate. No corporation wants to compete with a plant that grows 3 times faster than trees, requires half the water of cotton, absorbs toxins from the soil, produces edible seeds, and simultaneously makes textiles, oils, ropes, building materials, and biodegradable plastics. It's too much in one package. Too efficient. Too unprofitable for industries that rely on slow-growing resources. So instead of competing, they attacked. They painted hemp with the same brush as psychoactive cannabis, even though the two are entirely different in use and chemical structure. The smear campaign worked because it was simple: confuse the public, criminalize the plant, destroy the competition. And just like that, a crop used for thousands of years across Asia, Africa, and Europe vanished from American soil almost overnight. When you look at these plants together, amaranth, purslane, lamb's quarters, hemp, you start to see a pattern that nobody in mainstream agriculture likes to acknowledge. The plants that empower communities, the plants that require the least dependence, the plants that offer the most nutrition for the least cost, those are the ones pushed aside. Meanwhile, crops that demand fertilizer, irrigation, chemical protection, high-maintenance seeds, and annual purchases, those are the crops promoted as essential. It's a business model masquerading as a food system. And most people never notice because they inherited these definitions without questioning them. They grew up hearing purslane is a weed, hearing lamb's quarters is invasive, hearing amaranth is a nuisance, hearing hemp is dangerous. But who told them that? And why? Every time I talk to someone who grows any of these plants intentionally, their reaction is the same. Why didn't we learn this earlier? Good question. Why didn't we? Why weren't these plants taught in school alongside the big 3 industrial crops? Why aren't they part of national nutrition programs when they outperform nearly everything? Why don't seed banks raise awareness about the species that grow without synthetic inputs? The answers aren't mysterious. They're uncomfortable. These plants give power to individuals and small communities, not corporations. They decentralize food systems. They eliminate dependencies. And history shows that whenever a plant reduces dependency, it gets ignored, regulated, or suppressed. But here's the twist. These plants are making a comeback. Quietly, steadily, stubbornly, just like they always have. Homesteaders are reintroducing them. Foragers are teaching them. Regenerative growers are planting them. Seed savers are preserving them. And people are realizing something that earlier generations knew intuitively. A plant doesn't need a marketing campaign to be valuable. Sometimes the best foods are the ones nobody is trying to sell you. What most people never see is how these weed classifications ripple through everything beneath the surface, literally. Soil science is one of the most misunderstood areas of agriculture, and honestly, that's by design. The last thing chemical-based farming models want is for everyday growers to understand how resilient soil actually is when you stop fighting it. Many of the plants labeled as weeds, amaranth, purslane, lamb's quarters, aren't competitors to crops. They're indicators of imbalances. They're nature's diagnostics tools. They appear to show you what the soil is lacking, what it's trying to repair, and what's happening biologically underground. But if you convince farmers these plants are the enemy, they end up depending on fertilizers and herbicides instead of understanding the signals the soil is giving them. And that is one of the biggest open secrets in the industry. Weeds are often the solution, not the problem. Whenever I walk onto land that's been overworked, heavily tilled, or chemically treated for years, the first plants that show up aren't weaklings. They're the pioneers. Amaranth roots break up compacted clay. Lamb's quarters draws up minerals from deep layers and brings them toward the surface. Purslane blanket covers exposed soil to prevent erosion and water loss. These so-called weeds actually restore damaged environments. But if you tell farmers that, if you educate them about the ecological role of these plants, they stop buying the products designed to fix the very problems nature is already addressing for free, and that's why the narrative had to shift. These plants had to be demonized so that the products could be commodified. Look at the historical record and you will see something fascinating. Nearly every time a plant offers a free benefit, there's eventually an effort to restrict, shame, or replace it. The clearest example is hemp, but the pattern runs deeper. In the early 1900s, certain agricultural boards advised farmers to eradicate purslane because it interfered with modern planted crops. But no one mentioned that purslane's presence reduced soil moisture loss, helped stabilize microbial communities, and made future crops stronger. Lamb's quarters was labeled a waste plant despite its exceptional nutrient profile, not because it harmed crops but because it was too good at thriving where fertilizers failed. The industry didn't dislike the plant. It disliked what the plant implied, that soils weren't as depleted as they claimed, that nature could regenerate without bags of NPK. And you know what I find most interesting after decades in this field? The growers who lean into these plants, the ones who let purslane grow, between rows who harvest amaranth along their fence lines, who use lamb's quarters as a companion green, they consistently report better yields, healthier soils, and less dependency on chemicals. These aren't fringe gardeners. They're serious growers. People who understand the difference between what is recommended and what actually works. The irony is almost poetic. The very plants that industrial agriculture told us to destroy are the ones regenerating the ground beneath our feet. But the suppression didn't stop at soil health. It extended into culture, language, even emotion. People were taught to feel embarrassed about having purslane in their garden, as if only bad growers had weeds. You don't realize how deeply psychological the conditioning is until you see someone sheepishly apologizing for lamb's quarters popping up in their raised beds, when early settlers depended on that plant to survive drought seasons. Or until you see someone meticulously pulling out amaranth while complaining about the price of quinoa at the grocery store. The disconnect is wild, but it's engineered. If you convince people that the free food growing at their feet is worthless, you can sell them substitutes they don't need. This hits even harder in urban farming circles, where access to land is limited and costs are high. I've taught workshops where people spend half their budget on soil amendments while walking past purslane growing by the sidewalk. They'll buy calcium sprays, while lamb's quarters stands 3 feet away loaded with bioavailable minerals. They'll purchase expensive greens mixes while amaranth leaves go untouched in vacant lots. It's not their fault. They genuinely don't know. Nobody taught them because nobody profits from teaching them. And this is exactly why these plants are resurfacing now. Because people are tired of being dependent. They're tired of paying for things that nature provides freely. If you spend enough time studying the cycles of food control, you notice that the same story repeats every few generations. A powerful plant emerges: hemp, amaranth, purslane, lamb's quarters. Even herbs like plantain or nettle, and society embraces it. People thrive on it. Then industries form around replacing it. Then narratives shift. Then the plant becomes marginalized or illegal. Then a few stubborn growers keep the tradition alive quietly. Then, decades later, the plant makes a dramatic comeback, usually through grassroots communities, not institutions. We are right in the middle of one of those comeback cycles now, and the institutions can feel it. What's even more interesting is the global pattern. In regions where people maintain a strong connection to their traditional foodways, these weeds are still openly eaten and celebrated. Lamb's quarters is a staple in India. Purslane is served proudly in Middle Eastern cuisine. Amaranth is still revered in Central America. Hemp remains foundational in parts of China and Eastern Europe. It is only in countries where the industrial agriculture system dominates that these plants are shamed or erased. So ask yourself, how did a plant go from vital food to problem plant, depending on which side of a border you re on? The biology doesn't change. The nutrition doesn't change. Only the narrative changes. And narratives always follow money. We're at the point now where even universities are quietly reversing course. Soil scientists are rediscovering the ecological function of these plants. Nutrition researchers are baffled by their densities. Regenerative agriculture is becoming mainstream enough that farmers are beginning to question the old weed classifications. It's not rebellion, it's practicality. Because sooner or later, every grower hits the same realization I did years ago. Nature isn't the enemy. It's the partner, the mentor. And the plants labeled weeds are often the ones doing the most for you behind the scenes. Here's the part nobody wants to put on record, but every small farmer, seed saver, and soil researcher whispers about when the cameras are off. The restrictions on these superfood weeds have nothing to do with safety, and everything to do with control. When you look closely, All the so-called reasons governments give for banning or discouraging these plants fall apart instantly. Amaranth? They claimed it spreads too aggressively, even though corn and rye spread far faster. Purslane? They dismissed it as a contaminant species, even while farmers quietly used it to rehydrate. Drought-killed fields because its roots excrete glucose that triggers microbial recovery. Lamb's quarters? Labeled a nuisance weed. Despite its leaves containing triple the calcium of spinach, and being one of the top nitrogen capturers known to regenerative agriculture. Hemp? Banned for decades for the crime of looking like marijuana. Even though it doesn't contain THC and produces 10 times more fiber per acre than trees without needing replanting. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Every single one of these plants disrupts the industries that make the most money from dependence, not self-sufficiency. Think about it. If farmers, or worse, everyday people, could grow a plant that doesn't need fertilizer, rebuilds soil on its own, produces complete proteins, regrows year after year, and outperforms subsidized monocrops, why would anyone keep buying fertilizers, supplements, or patented seed lines? You can't monetize a plant that grows by itself, feeds entire families, heals degraded land, and doesn't require a subscription model. And that's the real issue. Governments didn't just turn these superfoods into weeds by accident. They downgraded them because they were too resilient, too independent, and too farmer-friendly. A plant that doesn't need chemical support becomes a threat in a world built around chemical sales. A plant that reseeds itself becomes a liability in a world where corporations profit from annual seed purchases. A plant that keeps nutrients in the soil instead of stripping them? That's a nightmare for fertilizer manufacturers. So in the end, the ban was really a rebranding. Take a miracle plant, strip it of its reputation, call it a weed, and people will stop planting it. The strategy worked, at least for a few decades. But farmers today are quietly reversing the narrative. They're reintroducing these ancient problem plants into rotations when inspectors aren't looking. They're saving seeds that were supposed to be eradicated. They're swapping knowledge in closed Facebook groups, old-school farming forums, and seed-saver meets. Because they know one thing for sure. The most powerful crops aren't always the ones government agencies approve. They read the ones that survive without permission.